So off to our presentation, I'd like to welcome back one of our previous colleagues, who's also a wonderful trainer of ours. She comes to us with over 16 years of experience working with children and families. Her name is Zulema Rubalcava. She is the Pediatric Partnership Program Officer for San Francisco Department of Early Childhood, where she designs and implements activities that support prenatal, postnatal, infant and toddler health and wellness, early identification and intervention, and pediatric quality improvement efforts. She has been the Developmental Screening Manager for Help Me Grow San Francisco Support for Families, a support system for pregnant women, caregivers with new babies, and families with young children with developmental delays and disabilities. She has worked for High-Risk Infancy Interagency Council as a special needs project program manager, a demonstration site project that introduced family-centered developmental screening in early childhood settings. It's so great to have you back, Zulema. Please uh, join me in welcoming Zulema for today's presentation.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be back too, and to be here and present um, with you today. Let me just get situated here. And here we go. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Leah, for having me back. And I'm so excited to be presenting this really important topic, the Introduction to the Ages and Stages Questionnaire, third edition. So it is ASQ-3. I usually just drop the 3 because it doesn't really mean anything other than the third edition. So if I reference it, I'll just say ASQ. Um, but we have a full day, we have 2 hours, and just to sort of orient you a little bit about what we're going to be learning about today, we're going to go over the benefits, so why it's important to be providing these questionnaires to your families, um, why developmental screening is such a key part of early childhood and early childhood education. We're going to talk about the tool itself, the questionnaire, the ASQ, mostly the features that are going to be the most helpful in helping you to implement these questionnaires with your families. And the most important part is really talking about the results of that screening, right? So it is a scored questionnaire, but the score is just a number, and we're going to talk a lot about how to interpret that and how to put it into context with everything else that children are doing. And because this is a family completed or parent completed or caregiver completed questionnaire, we're going to talk a lot throughout the whole presentation around having strategies for involving and engaging and communicating with families throughout the process while we're doing this developmental screening um, system in our sites. And then the last part, we're going to talk a little bit about what to do next, right? So I always say that screening really starts at the point where you score, right? Everything else is just paperwork. And then really the screening is what we do with that information. How do we connect it back to that individual child? And how do we make sure that we're using that information in the most appropriate way to support and promote the next stage of development for these children? So I also want to just talk a little bit about, oh, and let me, as I'm doing this, let me pull up my chat so that I can see any questions. I'm also really, I tend to talk really fast. And so if you want to, if I'm not, if I'm going too fast or if you need more clarification, please feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, put the question in the chat, because I do want you all to leave here having all your questions answered. So, okay. And so I want to also just sort of orient us into some common terminology that we're going to be talking about and that you might have already heard, right? So I'm going to go over all of these more in depth, but we're going to talk about what screening is, what is a diagnostic assessment, and what is monitoring, all in sort of the context of building this system of early identification. So what we're going to be focused on today is screening. So screening is a really brief procedure that is designed to identify children who we have questions about, who should receive more intensive assessment, or who we think there's something might be going on with their development, right? So it's very similar to, when you have a checkup at the doctor, right? You go in, they put you in a room with the nurse checks your blood pressure, she checks your eyes, your hearing, your weight, right? That's all screening. They're just checking in to see if things are um, if they look the way that they should be looking, right? So, for example, you might go in and they're checking your blood pressure, and it could be that your blood pressure is too high. They don't know why, right? Maybe you had an extra cup of coffee because you were running late. Maybe you missed your first bus and you had to run. And so your blood pressure is a little bit elevated, right? There's a lot of reasons why, or there could actually be something going on with your cardiovascular system. They don't know. They're just screening to identify those concerns and say, oh, something's going on. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's ask some questions. Let's run some more tests. And then we can figure out why your blood pressure is too high from what we would expect to see for somebody your age at this time, right? That's very similar to what we're doing with children. We're screening everybody. And then some children might have some concerns that we want to maybe check in a little bit more, ask some questions, maybe run some more assessments or do some more digging. And then that way we can figure out what might be happening. So the next step in the system, which we're not going to talk a lot about today, but we are going to um, reference it, is that diagnostic assessment. So this is the next step after screening, right? So if we started here, we would be sending all of our concerns to a diagnostic assessment, right? If we refer to GGRC, sorry, not GGRC, the regional center, I think for you guys it's East Bay Regional Center, um, or your school district for special education. Those are really in-depth assessments, and they're usually done by a professional, right? So they're usually done by a speech language therapist, a school psychologist. And so they can be really expensive because those people have a lot of experience and background. So the diagnostic assessment should be the second step, right? We screen everyone, we identify concerns, and then we send those children who we have the most concerns about to a diagnostic assessment to be done in that area of concern. Um, and then that assessment is often used to make children eligible for those intervention services, either through the regional center or through the early childhood special education system. So we want to screen everyone and then reserve the diagnostic assessment really for that next step of those children that we're the most concerned about. And then there's one last sort of piece, which is the monitoring, right? So monitoring is using all of our information, right? Our toolkit, our what we call eyeballing, to continue to look at a child who might have some concerns, but maybe isn't eligible. And so we might want to monitor, we might want to screen more frequently because we're just monitoring that concern and doing a little bit of screening and surveillance at the same time. So we're taking in more information and we're using that to see if we continue to screen and provide intervention, or if we screen and things are still not looking, or we're providing intervention and things are still not moving forward, then we might want to send for that next step, right? That diagnostic assessment. And I'm going to go over sort of that whole system a little bit later when we get to sort of the next steps. But I just wanted to kind of give you some common terminology at the beginning so that so when I say assessment or where I say screening, you know kind of what I'm talking about. But I do also want to, just from the beginning, remember that screening does not diagnose delays or disabilities, right? It doesn't say this child has a developmental delay. It is not a diagnostic tool. That's that second step, diagnostic assessment, right? That's what diagnoses. Screening also, we don't want to use the ASQ as a way to identify specific child goals or skills. but it just gives us more information on that general area, right? So we don't want to, how we say, maybe like teach to the test, right? We don't want children to just be able to do those 6 skills on the ASQ. We want them to really have a lot of experience in that general area. So we don't use the ASQ as a way to maybe build lesson plans or to target goals. So why is it important to be screening everyone? We know that in California, 1 in 4 children under the age of 6 are considered at risk. And that at risk does a lot of work, right? So what does that mean? What puts a child at risk? A lot of things tend to put a child at risk, right? So being exposed to trauma at a young age, having high levels of toxic stress, um, genetics put children at risk, but the one that I focus on the most is poverty, because poverty is something that really puts a child at risk. And we know that the area that we live in, the Bay Area, tends to be a really expensive place for families, right? And so if we think about the federal poverty level for a family of 4, um, it's really so a family who lives at the federal poverty level is a family of 4 who makes less than $32,000 a year, right? So we know that about 10% of our population is at the federal poverty level. But we are also um, we also consider sort of what a sort of living wage or a medium wage. So a family is considered low income in the Bay Area for a family of 4 if they make less than $156,000. So that puts a lot of our families at risk of living in poverty, right? So they are considered low income if they're not making $150,000 a year for a family of 4. And so we know that for us specifically, this statistic might actually be a little bit smaller, right? So a lot of our children are at risk. And we know that in California, we're doing a better job, and some counties do better than others, but we're not really providing those opportunities to screen in a timely manner, right? Only 28.5 children receive timely screenings. And when I say timely, for me, that means periodically, right? So you can screen when a child is 9 months and then everything is progressing typically, like there's not a lot of concerns. That trend doesn't necessarily hold at 12 months, at 18 months, at 24 months, right? A lot can happen between when a child is 9 months and when they're 2 years old. And so when I say timely screenings, I mean periodically, right? We want to keep checking in because we know that the first 5 years, so much is happening and so many important things are building that foundation um, for later learning in life. And so we want to continuously check in, not just screen once, no concerns, we're good. We also know that, those 10% of our families that are living at the federal poverty level, California ranks 44th in the country for screening those children that are the most at risk. And so it's really important for me to be here and to share this information because I really want these numbers to be improving and that we're um, consistently providing opportunities for families to learn more about how their child is developing and to find supports when there are concerns around how their child is developing. So I'm really thankful that you guys are taking your time today on a Friday morning, gorgeous Friday morning, to sit and listen to me talk about this because it is a big passion of mine to make sure that all children are prepared to enter school ready to learn. So I'm going to pause and do a little activity to sort of think about what are the benefits for you all to provide these screenings? What do you see as a benefit of using these questionnaires with your family? I'm also going to, I forgot to do this, but I'll do it now. I'm going to pop the link in the chat. So if you don't have your phone or if you want to use something else, That's the link for the Mentimeter. And as you guys are doing that, I'm going to pause and share. And here we go. So here's what you guys are saying about what are some benefits for you to provide these questionnaires. Early intervention, early detection, early intervention. Yes, we know research shows how important early intervention and early detection is, right? It works. And for most children, all they'll need is just a small bit of intervention, a small bit of support, and they'll be right back to meeting milestones the way the other children their age is. It's preventative. It opens access to resources. Yeah, yeah, the earlier the better, right? Screening early means best chances for early intervention. We really want to make sure that we're supporting child development, give families support, help children thrive. To further understand a child, yes, this is also a really great tool to learn more about this specific child because we know children are unique, right? They grow at their own pace, and so it's really also a good way to have a better understanding of that child in your center. It also strengthens provider family partnerships. You guys are so on it. Yeah, these are all great. Perfect. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing this. So a lot of you guys already hit on the the main topics, right? So what are the benefits for you? It identifies children who are at risk so that we can get them connected to early intervention as soon as possible. It also, we learn more about the child, right? So it's a great opportunity to see where the child's strengths are and to also identify opportunities for support and connect them to those supports or provide those interventions and those opportunities to support and to practice some of these skills. It also, a lot of you guys talked about this as well. It's a way to strengthen that relationship with your families so that we can address some of those concerns that they might have, right? It's also a great way to help families understand more about developmental milestones and development, and to really help families have the language to talk about their child's development, to really empower their advocacy skills, to help them learn how to ask for support. And so we'll talk a lot about that as well. Let me just make sure I have my chat back up. I have a question asking about early intervention and how would I explain early intervention services to a parent. So that is a great question. We are going to talk a little bit more about early intervention and those services. So early intervention is a system for children birth to 3, and then there's early childhood special education for children 3 to 5. And what it is a way to address developmental concerns with a professional, with services. And I'll talk a little bit more about both of those systems. But what I would say to a family who I might be referring to one of those systems is I would talk a lot, and we're going to really dive more in detail later. But I would just say, these are agencies that can help support your child's development. They're going to, I would walk them through the process. They're going to ask you some questions. They're going to, do some activities with your child, and they're going to talk about what services they might be able to offer you as a family to help support your child's development, right? So a lot of it is really just how we frame what early intervention is. It really is a way to get your child some support and some opportunities to help support their development and promote their development so that they can reach 5 years old and be ready to enter school. A lot of it is framed through like school readiness, but it's also a way to support the family. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is kind of what early intervention is. And hopefully I answered that question. If not, let me know and I can go a little bit deeper. And we talk a lot about sort of making sure that our systems are equitable and to that point, I say a universal screening and monitoring system, right? So using a validated screening tool like the ASQ alongside with all of our own expertise. Uh, that also has in our system individualized and comprehensive follow-up. It promotes social equity and maximizes a child's ability to enter school ready to learn, right? So when I'm talking to families, I always say that this is something that we do with all of our families because we want to learn about every child in our care so that we can provide the best experience for them to learn, right? So really learning more about how your child plays, learns, interacts with others helps us really individualize his or her experience, right? So we really want to make sure that we're doing that for all of our children so that everyone is ready to learn. So making sure that we're providing this opportunity to everyone really helps sort of level that playing field for all of the children who might be at risk because of other circumstances. So having this opportunity that's really an easy way to and not really expensive, doesn't take a lot of time, is a great way to just sort of make sure that all of our children are getting the support that they need. I also want to talk a little bit about sort of the one of the features that we like about the ASQ, which is how adaptable and flexible it is, especially for all of our families. We know that the Bay Area is a very diverse uh, area that has a lot of different types of families, cultural parenting practices, income levels, structures for families. And so one of the reasons that the ASQ is so widely used is because it's so adaptable to be able to, you know, be appropriate for all families. So some of the things that make it so adaptable is that you can administer it in a lot of different ways, right? There's not just one way. For example, diagnostic tools sometimes are very rigid in how they're administered. They have to be done exactly the same in exactly the same method, and children have to do it this way in order for it to be validated. The ASQ is not like that. So it is really flexible. You can do it over the phone, you can do it in person, you can start it, put it down, pick it up, right? It doesn't have to be completed all in one sitting. It doesn't have to be done, in one method. There's a lot of different ways that you can administer this tool. Also, the materials that it uses can be adapted, right? So for example, there's a question, I think in the personal social around using eating utensils, right? And I think the language on the ASQ says, spoon and fork. Well, not all families use spoon and forks. Some families use their hands, some families use chopsticks. And so you can swap that out, right? You can say, if you use chopsticks, use chopsticks. You could cross it out and say eating utensils, which can include hands, right? As long as we're keeping the intent of the question, which at that point is at the personal social, it's not really about like fine motor, it's about self-feeding, right? And so if they're able to use their hands to feed themselves, that's what is culturally part of their system, then you can swap that out. Also, when they did the research on the ASQ, they normed it, or they did the research on their sample uses a lot of diverse populations. So they really they really tried very hard to sort of make sure that all families were using this and that it was making sense to them and that it felt like something that they could answer these questions, right? It's not specifically focused on just one type of family. There's a question also in the chat about if there's any restrictions on who can facilitate or administer the questionnaire. There is not, right? So if you're trained, like you're getting trained right now, and you sort of understand it, anybody can hand these out, right? So it doesn't have to be done by a professional. It can be done by anybody in like a community-based organization. As long as you have sort of the training around how to administer, then anybody can administer these questionnaires. It does not take a professional, which is also one of the reasons why we really like this tool as well, because it can be done and basically any setting, right? So you see lots of different people using the ASQ. You see, early childhood educators, family, child care educators, friends and family neighbor care, doctors, nurses, social workers, family resource centers, literally everywhere. So because it is so adaptable and flexible. And when we talk about the score, and we're going to get to the score soon, it also allows you to omit answers or items that are contrary to a family's beliefs, traditions, and values, right? So families can choose to not answer a certain amount of questions, and we can still have enough information to make some recommendations or to interpret some of the information that we're seeing. So we really there are questions that might feel a little bit contrary to what a family's cultural or traditions or values would yeah, so some questions might be inappropriate for us to ask, right? And so we can skip that question. The family can choose to not answer that question, and the score will still give us enough information so that we can really make those best recommendations for next steps and follow up. So let's dive in. Right into the tool. So I know that we've also been sharing a link to handouts. One of the handouts that I do want to highlight, there's two handouts really right now. So the first one is the quick start guide. That's going to be, if there's only one handout you can download, that would be the one. It's basically going to cover everything that I'm going to talk about today in a much shorter way, but it's going to talk about scoring, it's going to talk about interpreting, it's going to talk about communicating results, all of that. And then the second one that I want to highlight right now is if you have the opportunity, if you want to pull it up, there is a sample scored questionnaire that you can look at as I'm talking about these features so you can sort of see it. I do have pictures, but they're sometimes a little bit small depending on where you're viewing or what screen you're using. So what are the ages and stages questionnaire? What is the ASQ? It is a parent or family completed screening tool. So we really want to make sure that we're handing this directly to families because they're the ones who are going to have the most information about their child. And we really want to encourage family involvement, family engagement. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why it's important. Um, they are a series of questionnaires for children as young as 1 month, all the way up to 5.5, 66 months. So there is a questionnaire that's appropriate for the age and stage of every child 1 month to 5.5 years old. They have been highly vetted and researched, have been around for more than 30 years. And they have a lot of research behind them to give us a lot of confidence that they're really going to accurately identify the children who are most at risk and who would benefit most from that next step of assessment. And it's also a great way to talk to families about child development and to help guide them on developmental promotion, right? So a lot of times we talk about children that we have concerns about in a deficit-based language, right? Like they're not doing this, they're not doing that. But we really also want to highlight the strengths, right? And this is a great tool to show everything that the child is doing, even if there are concerns, right? And so it's a great way to also talk about this is what's coming next, right? Here's the next stage of development, and here's what we can do to help promote that development and help the child reach that next stage. And so it's really a great tool to talk about strengths, to talk about opportunities, and to give families more information about milestones and ages and stages, right? So like each area has a stage of development that the child is going to move on to. And so it's a great way to say, here are some things that might be coming up, and here are some things that we can do to help promote some of those next skills that the child is going to be learning. Okay, so let's talk about that parent report. One of the first questions I usually get is, can we trust families to fill out these questionnaires? And I'm here to tell you yes, parents are highly reliable when reporting on their child's development specifically, right? There are, and this is an old study, but it holds true still to this day. When ASQ did their research, they had a professional and a family member do an ASQ independently on the same child. And when they did that, they found that there was 93% agreement between the parent and the professional, right? So 93% of the time, they were reporting exactly the same thing. And again, there are lots of studies that go into how parents are very reliable reporters. In fact, there was one study I think I read, maybe it was like 10 years ago, um, when autism was sort of more on the rise, and there was a study that was shown that said families were identifying concerns of children on the spectrum at a much higher rate than pediatricians were. And so we know that families have, that gut instinct. They know when something is not, when something's wrong. And so we really want to lean on them to let us know what their observations are, because they are the experts on their child. We might be experts in our field, we might be experts on child development, but they are the experts on their child. They know their child the best. And so we really want to give them that opportunity to share what they know with us so that we can then use our expertise in a better way together. So 93% is not 100%. I know that. We're never going to get there, but there are differences, right? There are going to be times when we're seeing something a little bit different than what the family is sharing with us. And there's lots of reasons for that, right? So some of the reasons that we have is backed by research is that often professionals may underestimate a child's skill, right? We're so used to seeing children at every stage that we might think a child should be at this stage when really they're not. And so we might say, oh no, that child is not doing the same thing as this child, who might be, a little bit above average in skill building, right? And so sometimes we might forget that they're at their right stage and that skill is typical. And so we might say, oh, there's a concern because we're underestimating that child. We also know that when there is that higher agreement, it's because it's something that's really easily observed. And the ASQ does a really great job of trying to use questions that are very easily observed, right? For example, there's a question on gross motor that says, can your child stand on one foot balance on one foot for 10 seconds? That's really easy to see, right? No matter where I'm standing, you're going to see it, I'm going to see it, we're both going to see the same thing. I have another question in the chat. The question is, are these questionnaires similar to what some care providers share during well-child visits? So experiencing this with their own children during Kaiser pediatric visits. Yes, yeah, a lot of times there are doctors who are using either the ASQ or maybe a different questionnaire. The ASQ is not the only screening tool. It's the one um, that we recommend just because it is so family-centered. It's really easy, but there are other tools. So I'm not sure which one Kaiser is using, but it is similar. The ASQ, there's other questionnaires that are being used in doctor's office. Like there's the PEDS, there's the SWIC, but yeah, some doctors will use the ASQ in their practice at well child because they are also required at certain points in the well child visit schedule to provide a validated screening tool. So higher agreement, and what we know is that families tend to report more emerging skills. So children tend to try things out in places where they feel more comfortable or feel less observed, right? So they might try out a skill at home first, right? And really perfect it before they show it off at school, right? Because they don't want their friends to see them not be able to, kick that ball and then fall. And so So sometimes we might not be seeing that skill in our classroom, but the family has seen it, emerging. And so they might be reporting on some of those skills a little bit earlier than what we're seeing, just because of how children are different in different settings and in different um, places and with different people, which is what I just said. And so really it's a great tool to engage families at the start, right? So we know research also shows that children have better outcomes when their families are involved at an earlier age in their school and in their development. So we want to give lots of opportunities for families to become involved. And this is one of the really easiest ways, right? To ask questions, have them answer some questions about what they're observing their child skills and what they're doing. It also is a great way to validate their concerns. A lot of times, we might not be seeing the concerns because, again, children are different in different settings and with different people. But this is also a really great tool that encourages and provides really teachable moments, and to empower families when they say, hey, I'm worried, right? I think they should be doing this. And it's a great way to like have them voice those concerns and to build a structure for that observation, and to really show families that we are interested in what they're observing, what they're noticing, what they're saying, and that we're not only noticing it, but that we need it, right? We know how important their expertise is for us and for us to do our job. And so we really want to make sure that we're giving those opportunities, and using a family completed questionnaire, a parent completed questionnaire, is one of the best ways to start that process and have families sort of gently sort of become part of our team. Um, and it does help bridge that communication, because once we open that door, right, by saying, hey, can you just give us a little bit more information, we can start to build that bridge towards making it a free flowing conversation around how can we best support this child. Okay. So like I said, there is a questionnaire that's appropriate for the age and stage of development for all children, starting as young as 1 month all the way up until 5.5 years of age, right? And so the first 2 years, the questionnaires are really spaced closely together, right? Because we know that this is where the most growth happens, right? If you think about a 1-month-old baby and a 2-year-old child, like literally little blob going from walking to talking in 2 years. That's crazy. That's really quick, right? And so we want to make sure that we have a lot of different questionnaires to sort of span that very rapid growth, right? So you'll see that in the first 2 years, each questionnaire is only spaced 2 months apart. And then things start to slow down a little bit. Not a lot, because 5 years is, you know, quick, but it slows down a little bit. And so from 2 up until 3, that next year, we space them out 3 months apart. And then from 3 to 5, it slows down a little bit more. And so we're able to space them out 6 months apart. And so why this is important is because we want to make sure that we're providing the most appropriate questionnaire, so that we're asking the right questions for the age and stage of development, right? It's right there in the name, ages and stages. And so we want to make sure that we have enough questionnaires at any point. If a child comes to us and we say, hey, which questionnaire do I need for his age? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But some recommendations, that 9-month questionnaire, you see there's a little asterisk. That was developed in this edition for pediatricians, right? So somebody just asked about Kaiser pediatric visits. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends children to be screened at 9 months, 18 months, 24, and or 36 months. And so before the ASQ, the third edition came out, there was only that 8-month and 10-month. And so they really wanted to make sure that there was a 9-month questionnaire just for pediatricians to be able to use. And then the way that we sort of recommend setting up a system is screening maybe under the age of 2 every 4 to 6 months. We're monitoring it. And then once after they turn 2, maybe every 6 months or up to a year. But I always say really choose you can't screen enough, but you can screen too little, right? And so choose a system or a periodicity or a cadence that doesn't overtax your system, but that provides enough opportunities, right? If you could only screen once every year, that's better than nothing at all. So really, based on these recommendations and based on your capacity, try to come up with a cadence of screening that feels comfortable for you and feels comfortable for your families. These are just recommendations. So today we're only going to be talking about the ASQ-3, but because we do have the ASQ-SE training coming up in 2 weeks, I do want to talk a little bit about the differences. So the ASQ covers 5 domains, right? From the start, we look at communication, which is both what your child can say, expressive communication, and also what your child understands, which is that receptive, right? So that is communication, what they can say and also what they understand. We look at gross motor, which are those big muscles in the trunks and the legs, and how they're using those to start to sit, to roll over, to stand, to crawl, walk, run, jump. We look at fine motor, which are those small muscles in their fingers and how they're using those to play with toys, to feed themselves, to draw, right? These little muscles to dress themselves, all those little muscles in their wrists and their fingers. We look at problem solving, which is how a child is in their environment, right? How they solve problems for themselves, right? How they play with toys, how they are in their environment. And then lastly, we look at personal social, which sometimes gets confused for social emotional. There is a little piece around that, right? There is that social piece, but it's really more adaptive skills, which are those self-help skills, how they're moving towards independence, how they're becoming independent, right? Which is part of social emotional, but social emotional development is really broad. And so it requires a whole other questionnaire to just look at that piece, right? So social emotional development happens mostly when we are screening for it. We use another tool, the ASQ-SE, and we're going to have a training in 2 weeks about that tool because it is very, very different. Okay. So here we are, the 16, we're going to use the 16-month questionnaire as our sort of example. That's the one that's in your handout links. But the first thing that you see when you get the questionnaire is this cover page. And there's a couple of features that I want to highlight that are going to be the most important in terms of implementing a screening system, right? The first one is the administration window. So right here on the cover page, it tells you precisely who this questionnaire is for, right? So only children who are 15 months, 0 days, through 16 months, 30 days at the time of the screening should get this questionnaire, right? If they're younger, they get a different questionnaire. If they're older, they get a different questionnaire, right? So we will really want to make sure that we're using this window of administration to make sure that we are handing out the most appropriate questionnaire for the child's age and stage. The second thing that I want to highlight is there's this question around prematurity. And so this is something that for anyone who has infants and toddlers in their care, that they're going to be using this with their families. This is a really key feature because we want to make sure we know that children who are born preterm sometimes, not always, but sometimes tend to have some delays because of that prematurity, right? And so we want to allow those children the opportunity to sort of catch up to their peers who were not born preterm. And so we give them 2 years. So in those first 2 years, we want to adjust their age. And don't worry about this, we're going to go into more detail. But if you have infants and toddlers, my recommendation is always to get their birth date and ask about prematurity before we start handing out questionnaires, because there is a second step. If they are more than 3 weeks premature under the age of 2, we want to adjust that age and give them a different questionnaire if needed. The next feature that I want to talk about is when you flip the page and all of a sudden you start to see this. This is the important points to remember. This is a really great tool, especially if you're thinking about an administration system that maybe mails stuff home or sends home, with like the child in their backpack. This is a really good feature to highlight to families because it gives them some guidance around how to fill these questionnaires out, right? So we want to make sure that families know that this is not like a test, right? If they don't know if their child is able to do that skill, try it, right? Like get down and play and like put those skills to the test, right? So we really want to make sure that we're getting the best information possible, right? So if the family doesn't know, that's fine, right? There's a lot of questions, especially in the older ages, where a family maybe hasn't had the opportunity to observe those skills, right? So there's a question, I think, in the 48-month around beating, right? And I can't remember my parents ever sitting down and beating with me. Like that wasn't something that I did at 4 years old. And so that's something that you might want to say, hey, if you haven't seen it, try it. Make it fun, right? Make sure that it's something that we're not just sitting the child and say, here, show me this, right? Like make it a game, make it playful. That's what this is about, right? Children learn through play. And so we really want to make sure that we're helping families try these activities in a fun and playful way so that we can observe really what the child is able to do. Again, if we're going to do this and we're going to have the child there, we want to make sure that the child is well rested and well fed, because I don't know about you, but if you don't feed me and you catch me at a time when I'm really tired and you ask me to do something, you're probably not going to get the best out of me, to be honest. And that holds true for kids too, right? So like if we're skipping naps to try to fill this out, and we're trying to make the child do something when they're grumpy, we're not going to get the um, best and uh, best opportunity to observe. So again, we want to let families know that you can try this, but make it fun, make it playful. And here's some, and this is a great way to also support that promotion, right? A lot of times families might not have a lot of practice getting down on the floor and playing. And so giving them a little bit of guidance of how you can make that fun, right? Or if they don't, or if they are saying, well, I don't have beads, how do I do this, right? Give them other materials, shoelace and Cheerios. Sometimes that's the same, you can swap out those materials and you're still getting the same intent of the question, right? Of being able to put a small thing through another small thing. And then we get to sort of the main attraction, right? Which are those questions. These questions are so important. So 5 domains. In each domain, there are 6 questions. Every domain has 6 questions. And the way that we ask families to answer these questions is to read the question and say, yes, this is a skill that I see my child do all the time, no problem. Sometimes, this is a skill that, it's one of those emerging skills, like it's there, it's coming, it's not 100% yet, right? So they're just learning. So maybe out of 10 times that they try it, 3 or 4 times they accomplish it, right? It's there, it's coming. I see it sometimes. And then not yet, which is, oops, wrong. Not yet, which is this is a skill that I have not seen my child do yet. And for some families, we might really want to like highlight that yet. It's not that they're never going to do it. It's just that they're not there yet, right? And so when I'm introducing this to families, I might say something like, your child might be doing all of these skills, some of these skills, none of these skills, and that's okay, right? We really want to normalize this for families to let them know that all children develop at their own pace. Every child has their own, sort of rhythm. Even children in the same family develop wildly different, right? My niece and my nephew, couldn't be more different. My niece was a little chatterbox, could not, like, just was talking up a storm. And then her brother, same environment, same family, same everything, um, had to have speech therapy, right? My niece could not climb to save her life. My nephew, again, same child, same family, um, was running way earlier than his sister was, right? So all children develop at their own pace, and what this is just a way for us to learn more about um, your child's skills and progress. So these are just this questionnaire is just for a way for us to get to know your child better so that we can, see where his strengths are, what's in progress, and where we can support if needed, right? So we really want to make sure that families understand that it's okay if their child isn't doing this yet. A lot of times families will feel very pressured into saying yes because they don't want that child to be labeled. They don't want that child to be kicked out of school if they think, it's going to be too challenging to support them. But so we want to make sure that families feel comfortable in really telling us what their child is doing, right? So we want to make sure that families know that it's okay if they're not doing it there yet, right? That's what we want. We want to know where we can support, right? Where's the best place where we can put our energy to help support this kiddo's development. Also, these are written at a 4th to 6th grade reading level, and I highlight that as a feature because it really helps us figure out what our best implementation method might be, right? So if we know that a lot of our families have lower literacy rates, then a send home method might not be the best way to get this information. And so we really want to think about those families that might need a little extra support, might need somebody to sit with them, or might need a different method. And so that way we can set up a system that is really supportive to every family. Oh, I see another question. Is there another assessment that is used for 6 years of age and older? Absolutely, yes. So a lot of those are done by teachers in the school district. I don't know that there's one that is like a community-based or assessment for 6 years. And to be honest, that's not really my area of expertise. I've really spent most of my career in birth to 5, but I'm sure that I can figure that out and let you know which ones. But I think if you go to like a school district and ask what assessments they use, you might be able to find some that are also like screening tools for children older. But most of that is really done in the school at the school level. Okay. So 5 domains, 6 questions in each domain. The way that these questions are ordered is in a hierarchy, which basically means easy to hard, right? And so this is a great way to sort of check in on some of those earlier milestones. So for example, using the 16-month questionnaire as an example, questions 1 and 2 would be skills that you would expect to see a typically developing 12-month-old, right? Or if we want to get really really fancy about it, it's called the developmental quotient, right? So the skills of questions 1 and 2 in each of the domains in any of the questionnaires intervals are at a 75-month developmental quotient, right? So again, skills that a 12-month-old would be able to do in this example of the 16-month. Questions 3 and 4 are a developmental quotient of 88. So 88 of 100. So questions 3 and 4 in this 16-month are skills that you would expect to see a 14-month-old would be able to do. And then questions 5 and 6 are always at 100% of the developmental quotient, right? So any child that is 16 months old should be able to do these skills at 5 and 6. Oops. Sorry. Trying to get to the, oh, here, there's somebody put in the chat an example of a tool that can be used for 6 and up that is also filled out by the caregiver. Thank you, Molly. So helpful. So the reason that it's ordered this way is really, like I said, a way to check back on some of those earlier milestones. We know that often development builds on itself. And so if we can identify sort of the area or the stage where maybe things started to slow down, we can go back and like really do some activities and some interventions around those skills at that stage. And this is also a really great way to ease families in, right? So answering questions about things that might be a little bit easier, to say yes a couple of times feels better when you get to some of those harder skills where they might be, some slowing down, or they might not be there yet, right? Also, what we know is that for the 16 month, we can start giving it out as early as 15 months, right? And so when we get to questions 5 and 6 and the family's not there yet, it's fine, right? Because they shouldn't be there yet. They're only 15 months, but we can start handing these out. It's a way also to like gear up to that next stage, right? So here are some things that are coming. Here's some things that we can do to help promote those skills, and so that we can continue um, to support that child's development. Okay, actually want to highlight while we're here. So you might notice that all of the pictures and on the questionnaire as well, for each of the 6 questions and the way that you answer, there's this little line here. And then after each domain, there's this fine motor total. The ASQ is also a really visual questionnaire. So this is like a visual cue that at some point we're going to assign a numerical point value based on how they answered. And we're going to add all this up to get a total for this domain, right? And we're going to do that with each of the 5 domains when we score them. And I just want to highlight that because when we get to the next feature, which is the overall section, I want to highlight here that even though there's a question, there isn't a line next to these questions, right? And that's because this section, the overall section, is unscored, right? We do not score these answers because these are open-ended questions. And really, the purpose of this overall section is to not just look to see if the skill is present, but also to see if this is a functional skill, right? If the quality of the skill. Um, so for example, there's a question, there might be a question in gross motor around, does your child walk independently? And it could be that the family answers, yes, children is walking independently. And then we get to the overall section, and there's a question here around, do you think your child walks, runs, and climbs like other children their age? If no, explain, right? So it could be that they are walking independently, but they're only walking on their tippy toes, right? Which could be a concern. And so again, we want these skills to be functional. We want to look at the quality. And so that's why we don't score this. But this section provides some really important details around the functionality of the skill, the quality of the skill. There's also questions here that looks at family and medical history. We know health is a huge component of development. And so oftentimes if the child is just coming to our school, we might not know some of that, the health history or the medical history that might be impacting their development. And so this overall section really gives us a lot more information for us to use to interpret and to put into context some of the results of the scoring. We also ask questions about other concerns. And again, research shows us that parent concerns are very predictive, right? And so even if all of the scores are coming up above the cutoff or they're not indicating any concerns, if a family shares concerns in this section, immediate follow-up, right? Because we know that they might be feeling something that we might not be able to see yet. And so we really want to make sure that we're using the information in the overall section, even though it doesn't get assigned a score, still very key and still very important. And then the last feature of the ASQ that's going to help us with our implementation is the information summary sheet. My recommendation is always if you're going to send home, do not send this sheet right? This is for us as professionals or the people who are implementing the ASQ. This is a way for us to gather all of that information that the family is going to share with us into one place to really start to see the results of the screening. So each questionnaire has their own unique summary sheet. So this one is for the 16-month questionnaire. You cannot use this one for the 18-month or the 24-month, right? You can only use it because the cutoffs are going to be very different. But even though they're all unique, they have a very similar structure, right? So each summary sheet will have these sections, a place for you to transfer all of their, demographic information. It's going to have this bar graph with the cutoffs, and we're going to go into more detail, but you can already start to see some of the different shading here, right? So you can see this unshaded section, this gray shaded section, and then this other section. So here you're going to start to see where a child falls in their development, right? It also is going to have a place for you to transfer all of the overall sections. And again, you can visually start to see, right? Some of these answers are in capital letters and bolded. And so this is a visual cue that if they circled that answer, that's an indication that there's a concern there and we might want to follow up. There's always going to be, again, for the summary sheet, there's always going to be guidance for us too around how to score and how to interpret. So there's that piece there. And then there's going to be this follow-up action taken, right? So this is a way for us to also track some of the recommendations that we've been making, right? So if we have a very robust screening system where we're screening periodically and we want to just sort of keep a record of what we're recommending for the family. This is a great way to, when the family comes back and, we said, oh, here were some activities. How did that go? Were you able to do them? How often, right? So it's a way for us to just check in on the recommendations that we've made to the family. And then the last section is this optional box, right? So this is if you wanted to hand the family the questionnaire back, but you wanted a record of how they answered all of the individual questions, so that you only keep this, right, and not the whole questionnaire, right? If you wanted to save some paper or for whatever reason, you just want to keep this one sheet, but you want a record of how they answered all of the individual questions in each domain. This is where you can do that, right? So you could put in, Y for yes, S, Y, not yet, right? So that you can sort of see how they answered all of the questions in each of the 5 domains. Okay, so usually I like to start my screening process by talking to families, right, about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And usually I like to frame that initial conversation by trying to guess what they're going to ask me so that I get it out first, right? So these are the questions that are the most asked questions when families are handed a questionnaire. The first question is, I don't have time. Can you do it, right? Families are busy. They might not understand why you're asking them. Like, isn't this your job to really think about my child's development, right? And so I usually will frame my initial introduction to screening by saying, you are the expert of your child, right? This is a tool that was developed specifically for families. So it is important that you take the time to share what you know, right? Because what you know is going to help me do my job better. And so it's really important for us to get your observations, and is there a way that I can support you in this, right? If you don't have time, do you need more time? Would it make more sense to do it together? How can I support you? Because it is really important to get your information or your observations. Often I will get this question when I'm self-selecting or when I see sites self-selecting, right? They already have a child with some concerns and they just kind of want the family to be on board, right? So they do this thing where they say, here, why don't you tell me what you're seeing? But we know that families talk to each other, right? And so in order to avoid this question, I set up a system the way that it's meant to, right? A screening system is for all families. So I also let them know that, you know, this is something that I do with everyone, right? We offer these questionnaires to everybody. We know how important the first 5 years are in terms of learning and setting the foundation for learning. And so this is where the most growth is happening. And so we're just checking in to see if, to see how your child is doing, what they're learning, and how we can support that development. This is also really key, especially in this time right now. Um, the administration that we're in, all of the AI and data, it's really important to be transparent with families about the information, right? This can be sometimes very sensitive information, especially if there are a lot of concerns. So we really want to make sure that we're being transparent and also using this as an opportunity to bridge to support, right? So again, not this might not apply to you, but for the most part, the only people who have access to this are, the teachers. It's going to go into their child folder. So only people who have access to that will be able to see it. This is up to you. You can also share it with whoever you want, right? If you have other service providers, if you want to share it with your doctor, that's up to you. There might be services in the community that I think might be really beneficial for you and your family, where they might, want this information, but I'm never going to share this information unless I talk to you first and unless I get your permission, right? And so we really want to make sure that we're letting families know from the get-go, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is how we're doing it. So in that initial introduction, you should be maybe alleviating some of these frequently asked questions, so that families know what the purpose is, why we're doing it, who's going to see it. And that way there's not a lot of anxiety around answering these questions. So let's jump right into scoring. So once we have handed this out, right, we want to make sure that we're also handing out the right questionnaire. So I'm not going to go too much into depth because this is also in that quick start guide in your handout. But the way that we usually find the correct questionnaire is by finding the child's age at administration, right? And so the easiest way to do that is to subtract their date of birth from the date that they're completing the questionnaire. So that would give us their child's age in months and days. If they are premature, we would use the adjusted age, right? So we would get their age at administration, and then we would subtract the number of weeks from that age, and then we would have their adjusted age. And then we would use that age or their age at administration, depending on, to select the questionnaire. All right. This is in that quick start guide, but I'm also going to give you some tools. So we have the age calculator. You can download it as an app on your mobile phone or tablet, or you can just go to agesandstages.com. Under free resources, there's the age calculator, and it does all that for you, right? So you can see here either on the app or the website, you put in the date, you put in the date that you're doing the questionnaire, the child's birth date, the number of weeks they were premature, you hit calculate, and it gives you their chronological age, their adjusted age, and then it tells you specifically which questionnaire to use, right? So use the resources, it's a lot easier. I think this is also in your handouts, but if not, you can also get this at the agesandstages.com. But this is so if you already have maybe you already have a system that gives you their child's age, right? A lot of enrollment systems will tell you which age it is, or a lot of other like developmental apps already has that. So if you already know their age at administration, then you can just use this chart to tell you really quickly which questionnaire to use. So once we hand it out, we know that we've gotten the right questionnaire. The families go home, they fill it out. It comes back completed, and this is where we start to score, right? So the first thing is we're going to review everything. We're going to look at over if there are any answers that are missing. We might want to go back to the family and say, hey, did you forget to answer this question? Or did you have a question about it? Or do you need support around it? If the family says, you know what, that just doesn't feel right for my family, fine, no problem. But more information helps us make better recommendations. So I always try to go back and get answers to any missing items, unless it is inappropriate and the family says they don't want to answer it. Like I said, depending on how they answer, we're going to assign each question a numerical score, right? So anytime a family answered yes, we give that question 5 points. 10 points. Yes, 10 points. Sometimes are 5 points, and not yet are 0 points. We're going to go over the overall section, right? We're going to make notes of any concerns that they're sharing with us so that we can follow up. If a family doesn't want to answer a question, it's fine, but there is a second step that we have to do, and we'll talk about how to adjust when a family skips a question. And then we're going to transfer all of that to our summary sheet so that we can start to see visually the results, right? So let's talk about when a family doesn't answer a question. We don't leave it blank, right? Because if we were to leave it blank, that would be like assigning that question 0 points. And 0 points has a very specific category, right? 0 points is not yet. And this is not a not yet, it's an I don't know. And it's inappropriate for me to ask, right? So we don't want to penalize the child for, their family's traditional cultural practices and beliefs. So we want to adjust the score. We want to give them credit, so to speak, right? So we want to get an average of how they answered the other questions in that area. So we would score it up the way that we would normally do, right? With that missing question. So we would get an area score, and then we would divide that by the number of questions that they did answer. And that would give us an average amount of points, right? So based on how they answered all the other questions in that area, we would be able to confidently say this is about the average score that they got. So then we would assign that average score back into the missing answer, and then we would add it up to their area score, and we would get an adjusted total. I know it looks complicated, but we're going to do it together right now. So take some time. And I just want you to notice here the question that's not answered, right? So while looking at himself in the mirror, does your child offer a toy to his own image? For a lot of Native American and Indigenous cultures, mirror play is highly discouraged. And so if I were to ask a family of that cultural background and practice this question, it would be really inappropriate. So we would just leave that blank, right? But we would adjust the score. So take some time to add up this area, and don't put the answer yet, but I want you to just sort of enter it into the chat. And then when I say go, hit enter, and that way we'll have like a waterfall. Okay, so 45, some 54s, some 45s, some 54s, some 45s. 54s. It's really consistent. Okay, let's do it. Okay. So yes, 10 points, 10 points, 10 points, leave blank for now, 10 points, 5 points. So if we were to just do it like this, we would come up with 45, right? But we didn't adjust. So anybody who said 45, you didn't adjust the score. And so we're now essentially penalizing them for not answering this question, right? So we do the next step, right? So we take this 45, we divide it by 5, right? Because this is how many questions they answered. Let me do the laser pointer, sorry. So we add it up, right? and we divide 45 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we get an average when we do that. 45 divided by 5 is 9 points. So we get an average, right? And it makes sense because if you see how they answered all the other questions, right? Yes, 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 and then one sometimes, we could confidently say that had this question been appropriate, they probably would have gotten around 9 points, right? And so we would add it back up, and now we get 54 points. Okay. So again, we really want to make sure that we're not leaving this blank because that would have given them a 0, and it's not an accurate representation, right? We can see that for the most part, they're really hitting most of their milestones at this point, right? And so had we left it blank, it might have pushed them into the monitoring zone, and that's not really indicative of what the other questions are telling us that they're able to do. And so we do want to make sure that we're adjusting the score. I always do this as a way to just make sure that we're understanding the concept. But again, there are resources, the same resources. So the same place where you download the app for calculating the age is, and on the website, there's also the adjusted score calculator. So this is also going to be really key, especially as you start to implement these for the first time and you're still getting used to the scoring. I would recommend that you use this calculator just anytime that there's a missing answer that you can't get questions, right? So you just enter the questionnaire, right? So for this example, we would say ASQ-3, one question unanswered, 45, and then calculate, and it would do that whole thing for you again. Also on that quick start guide that I keep talking about in the back page, there is this, there's also this table. Sometimes, especially if like you might not have access to the internet, or you might just be doing it really quickly. You're scoring a lot of questionnaires and you don't want to keep going back to the app or to the internet. This is also a really good resource because it has all of the possible area scores, and then it adjusts the score when there's one question missing and two questions missing. And this is also really visual. You can skip up to 2 questions per domain and still have an adjusted score. More than 2 questions missing in one domain, and there's just not enough information for us to confidently say, this is what we think, right? Because that would be like half of the questions missing, right? There's only 6 questions. So if you do see areas with more than 2 questions missing, that's really an indication that something's going on for the family. Like maybe they didn't understand, maybe they're having a hard time filling it out by themselves. Maybe there's something going on, right? So I would go back to the family and try to retake all the steps, right? Did I answer all of their questions? Is my system supportive enough? Is there something else that I could be offering to make it easier for families to answer these questions? Because in my experience, families love talking about their child, right? And so if I've given all of the support needed, usually I don't see a lot of missing questions. So this is just in case, right? So here is an example of a completed questionnaire, right? So this is where I say screening starts. Everything up until now has been paperwork, and this is where really the work starts, right? So now we have the scores in each of the 5 domains. We have some of the overall questions and some of the comments, right? And so this is really where we would start to say, okay, well, based on what I know, here are some of my recommendations, right? But how do we get from here to here, right? What do we know, and how do we use this, right? Because what does a 30 in communication mean to you, to families, to anybody, right? It's really taking that information and then putting it into context. So right now, after this questionnaire, what do we have, right? We have all of the scores in each of those domains. We have the responses, but what other things might we look at that might factor into the child's screening results? So here's another Mentimeter. again, I forgot to, let me put it into the chat. So here's the link to this Mentimeter. This is going to be a word cloud, so we can start to see maybe some trends of like other things that we might want to consider, other factors that might be impacting this child's response. Got it. Okay, so here are some of the other factors that you are saying could impact. Environment is a big one. We're seeing poverty is also a big one. ACEs, right? The adverse childhood experiences, yeah. And that could be part of the environment, that could be part of the health, cultural or language, literacy, parenting style, temperaments, mental health, culture, illness, hunger or sickness, parents' mental health, attachment differences, time of the day, absolutely. Culture, environment, mental health, poverty, distractions. So all of these are really, yeah, you guys are hitting all of the things that we want to be considering, right, when we're interpreting these results. So you guys hit on all of it, right? So what are some of the things? Communication styles. You guys said that, right? Parents' communication, their parenting guidance, right? We know that some families culturally might really encourage a lot of communication, let children be part of those conversations. Other families, might be a little more quiet or might value, some self-reflection, some silence. We know that environment plays a huge impact on development, right? So some families, their geography or their environment might be not conducive to some of those bigger gross motor skills, right? They might live in small houses or in cramped housing with lots of people. They might not have access to playgrounds because of their geography. It might be, very industrial where they live, or it might not be safe to let children out during certain times of the day. They cultural, I think you guys hit on that, right? So a lot of the family's cultural beliefs and their cultural values, that has a big impact in, the types of materials that children have access to, right? Some families might not give young children books, right? Because books might be very highly valued, and you give a young child a book for infants and toddlers. What are the first things that they're going to do is put it in their mouth. They're going to chew it, right? All of that early literacy skills, great, but they might not want their books to be gummed, right? They might say these are really valuable books, so we don't give them those materials. Or certain families might say, this child shouldn't play with balls or shouldn't play with Barbies or dolls, right? So all of that goes into the access and opportunities to practice. Parenting practices, right? You guys also talked a lot about that. Expectations for interdependence or independence, right? Some families really value that interdependence where we do things for each other, right? I feed you, I dress you, I, care for you. And this is how I show you how we are connected, right? And some families are like, you got to learn how to do it for yourself as soon as possible. Dress yourself, feed yourself, right? Those are all different parenting practices, and there's no judgment, right? They're all valued, but that could impact some of these skills, right? So some of the way that that families beliefs enter into the development of their child can impact, right? There are factors to consider. And so usually when we get to this point, right, we have to take all of that into consideration as we're interpreting the results of what we're seeing. And so what happens when we get a score, we start to say, okay, especially when there are concerns, right? You saw in that example of the completed questionnaire that there were a couple of scores that were, in that monitoring zone or below the cutoff, right? That's where this part comes in, is when we are seeing concerns, when we're seeing some of the results come back where children are not really meeting their milestones, that we want to say, okay, well, what else do I need to consider? What else should I be taking into consideration? And so when there's questions of this child is not doing this skill yet and should be, the next question is why not? Why is that child not, right? Is it a health concern? So if you remember, and actually let's go all the way back so that I can do this. Oh, here. So I can do this here. So if we're going to do the why not here, right? So let's talk a little bit about these results, right? So anything in this unshaded area is what we call above the cutoff, which basically means at this point in time, right? Because this is just a snapshot of this moment in time. It doesn't, it doesn't forecast trends. It's just what is happening today. At this point in time, the child appears to be meeting all their milestones, right? This other area, this gray shaded area, this is what we call the monitor zone, right? This is where children are meeting milestones, but it's a little bit slower than other children their age. And so we might want to do that interpretation of like, well, why not? Why are they not? And anything in this dark shaded area is what we call below the cutoff, right? And for us, this is an indication that at this point in time, the child is not meeting their milestones in this area. So we see this kiddo right now has a couple of areas where they're not meeting milestones at the same rate, right? And so what we want to do is talk about why, right? So we could look at this overall section, right, and see that there are some indications here of concerns that give us more information about some of these, right? So especially around communication, sometimes he ignores me. Okay. He doesn't say many words. Okay. Um, Ear infections and allergies. Okay. Grandmother uses a hearing aid. Okay. A lot of clues here, right? So let's dig a little bit deeper with family. Can you tell me more about how he ignores you, right? Is he ignoring you when you're face to face, or is his back turned and you're calling to him and possibly he can't hear you, right? He can't hear you. And we know that for a lot of kiddos, the way that they learn how to communicate is by um, copying your sounds, right? You start by going ba 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 ba, and they repeat back ba 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 ba, right? And so if they are having a hard time hearing it, they're going to have a hard time reproducing it, right? And so we want to also dig a little bit deeper. Okay, well, grandmother uses a hearing aid for how long? How old is grandmother, right? Sometimes we assume grandmother is, 70, 80. Grandmother could be 40 and using a hearing aid, right? So that's a history of hearing impairment. Has this child been seen for their ear infections, right? Is the doctor doing a hearing test to make sure that these ear infections aren't impacting their communication, right? So all of this is like the not yets. Well, why not, right? Is it because they're having a hard time reproducing? And all of this gives us information, right? Because if at this point where we're asking the questions and we're saying, hey, mom, tell me a little bit more, or hey, family, tell me a little bit more about what this looks like, and they say, oh yeah, no, they've already had a hearing test, everything is fine. Well, then I'm not going to recommend a hearing test. Then we're going to say, okay, well, what else haven't we tried, right? Have we tried singing more songs, right? Or, for example, if I don't ask and I say, okay, well, communication, let's give them, more words. Let's give them songs, books, rhymes, right? Like, let's just overload them with words. But then I didn't ask if they've had a hearing test, right? All of that intervention, if they can't hear it, is not going to answer the concern, right? So we really want to start to dig a little bit deeper, become detectives, so that we can start to really get a good recommendation. Okay, let's go back to where we were. Okay. For a lot of children, right, because of all of those factors, for a lot of children, it might just be lack of opportunity to practice, right? And so oftentimes what we might want to recommend is more practice, right? Give them more materials. So if they haven't been able to in that fine motor, I think there was some questions around scribbling, right? So uh, I would ask, do they have crayons at home? Do they have markers, right? And family might say no because I don't have time to watch them. And if I give them a crayon, it's not going to stay on the paper, right? Because why would it? Color is pretty everywhere. Color looks pretty on the walls, color looks pretty on the floors, color looks pretty on the furniture, color looks pretty on baby sister, baby brother, or the cat, right? So oftentimes families will say, I don't have time to watch, and so I don't give them those materials, right? And so that could be impacting their fine motor because they don't have a lot of practice, right? Maybe they haven't been to a child care center where there is a lot of opportunities to practice with lots of really high quality materials like water paints or waterproof crayons and markers. So we do really want to make suggestions that are relevant to the family and that help support family, and to also try to connect them to resources that might allow that child the opportunity to practice some of those skills. So I already talked a little bit about what the what the scores are, but let's talk about where they are, like what they mean, right? So this is a bell curve. Um, any assessments that are done usually fall, any assessments done on a population usually falls within this bell curve, right? So more than half of the population is going to be in this average area, right? There's going to be a small percentage that is a little bit above average, and then an even smaller percentage that's above average, right? This questionnaire is not for these kiddos. These kiddos are going to be fine, even these kiddos, right? But what we see is that also on the flip side is there's going to be a small percentage of children who are below average, and then an even smaller percentage that are way below average, right? And so that's where these cutoffs are. So the 60 points, right? So if a family says yes to every single question and they score 60 across all domains, all that we're saying is that this is where their children are, right? This is the end of the ASQ bell curve. Um, Again, because it could be that their children are here and here, but these kiddos, we're not really concerned about them right now. What we want is to find these kiddos and see if we can provide some interventions that might pull them closer to here, right? And so this is where the cutoffs are, right? So the monitoring zone is this one standard deviation from the mean, and this below the cutoff zone is two standard deviations. So important to know again that that's what the cutoffs mean, and that's where the children are when they're scoring in that range, right? And so again, like I mentioned, it could be for a lot of different reasons, and it's up to us to really figure out what's going on so that we can make the best recommendations around, is this a child that's going to be referred for that next level of assessment, that diagnostic assessment? Is this a child that we're going to provide some very intensive interventions in that area and then rescreen and monitor? So that's up to us, right? The next stage is really having those conversations with families, right? So once we get the screening and we start to make our own sort of internal interpretation, we want to then bring that to the family and see what they think, right? So we really want to make sure that we're involving families at every level in this process. So once we get the information back and we start to draw some conclusions and some interpretations, we want to then tell that to the family and see what they think, because they could be on a different page, right? And so we really want to make sure that we're doing this process together, right? Together, we're going to decide what makes sense for them in terms of next steps, right? They might share the concerns that we're seeing, they might not, but we could come up with some activities, right? We can say, here, this is what we're going to try it in our center. Here's some things that you could try at home, so that we're both working jointly on giving this kiddo lots of opportunities to practice or to, start to gain some new skills. We might recommend that we talk to other people, either within our own early childhood system or outside of it with community-based organizations. We know that for families, oftentimes families that are experiencing a lot of adversity, child development tends to not be a priority, right? And so we might see that a family is, having a lot of adverse experiences. Maybe they're dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity, job insecurity, and all of those things might be taking precedence because they have to, right? If I'm not sure, where my child is going to sleep tonight, I'm not going to be worried about whether they can, do a pincer grasp, really. So we really want to make sure that we're asking, for the family as well, can we alleviate some of these other adversities? Can we connect you to some care coordination, some case management that can help you, look for some solutions with these other things, so that we can then start to maybe move child development a little bit up into that priority category. And that really comes from having the vulnerability to have some of these challenging conversations, right? Especially when there's a lot of concerns for this child's development. So I usually think about having conversations that might be difficult around sharing really deep concerns about their child's development as sort of a staircase, right? And usually what happens is we all start sort of at the bottom, right? So we come into this screening process really not having any concern, not seeing any reason to refer. And then throughout the process, right, I'm doing my observations, the family's sharing their observations, and we as professionals might come to the conclusion that, oh, this is a kiddo who might benefit from that next level, right? That diagnostic. I might need to refer to some of those agencies, right? And so we go very quickly from no refer to refer. And for families who are still sitting sort of at that bottom, they haven't walked up the stairs as quickly as I have, right? Because I've been doing sort of the interpretation, I've been doing some of the questions, some of the seeking. And so I've come to this by walking up the stairs, but I'm going to then sit with the family and then automatically yank them up to refer. It's going to feel a little jarring for them, right? And so I might want to sort of gauge where the family is, right? So I might start to say, well, how do you think your child's development is going? Right. And then that's going to give me a lot of indication, because if they're like, yeah, great, no concerns, no issues, then I know that they're maybe not going to understand a referral right off the bat, right? So then I might want to start in no particular order. Again, these are just recommendations, right? I might want to start talking a little bit more, checking in, right? Especially if a family's like, yeah, I'm not really concerned, right? I might want to ask more about, what they're seeing that maybe I'm not seeing, right? Maybe they are seeing stuff that, or maybe they're already connected and they just don't want to tell us, right? So we might want to provide more information around milestones. Maybe they're not aware that these are things that a child should be doing at this age or could be doing at this age, right? And so we might want to say, hey, do you have other kiddos around this age that you're around, right? So a lot of times it's that comparative development, like, oh, these kiddos are the same age and that kiddo is doing a lot more talking than my kiddo, right? And so we talk about milestones. We talk about, how they're reaching these milestones and what sort of order these milestones come. A really big one is really addressing the fears. A lot of families have had a lot of harm done to them by educational systems, and they might say, I don't want my child labeled. I don't want them to feel lesser than, right? And so we might want to say, that's a really valid fear, and we're going to try our best to really make sure that that doesn't happen. Here are some other ways to get to the same. Not every path looks the same. Not every family has to go through some of these mandated agencies like the regional center or the school district. There might be other options that would address some of those fears around systems that might have that they might have some anxiety around, right? Sometimes it's just really about patience, right? A lot of families might have other ideas about why this is happening. And so they might want to check in with other people. They might want to get some second opinions, right? And so this one I think is the hardest for me because like we talked about, early intervention is so key, right? The earlier we can connect to support and resources, the better the outcomes. But sometimes it is just sort of letting families take a beat, really, process what they're being what's being shared. And then really being flexible. Again, not every family's journey has to look the same, right? Not every family has to go through this system. There's a lot of different ways um, to provide support that is really honoring the family's values and their wishes and their capacity as well, right? And so again, we want to check in at every point when we're having these conversations with a family that we think has a lot of concerns that would benefit from, more assessment or care management or care coordination. Some families, right, we start the conversation, we say, hey, just checking in. How did you think that felt? What are you seeing? And if they are like, you know, some families are going to be like, thank you, right? Thank you for sharing this concern. There's been something on my mind. It's weighing. I haven't really been able to put a name to it, but I've been worried. And now you're telling me this and you're giving me resources and good, sign me up. Who do I need to call? How do we move forward, right? They might be ready, right? You don't have to go through this whole staircase with them. Some families might, as you're starting to share some of the results and start to share some of your recommendations or your questions, they might, start to say, whoa, 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 what are you saying, right? Are you saying my child is, XYZ? And you might have to, you know, slow down and go down on this staircase and start to, have a different approach because they're not going to be, moving towards that referral if they need more time or if they don't agree with what you're seeing, right? So I think really when we're having these conversations, we need to be ready for all the family's reactions, right? And we go into this staircase in more detail in that navigating difficult conversations training that I think is happening at the end of February. So this is just a snippet of having those difficult conversations, especially when there are a lot of concerns. But we really want to make sure that we're validating, right? That we're being specific about what we're seeing, right? So we're using our own observations. We're asking those why not questions, right? We're asking what other factors we should be considering. And really, our job here is to join the family, right? We're not here to convince the family that our way, our system is the only way to do this, right? So it's not up to us to convince the family that they need this referral. It's up to us to listen to the family, tell us what they need to support them at this moment, right? So we really want to make sure that we're supporting whenever they're ready. And sometimes they might not ever be ready, right? Often or sometimes what I'll hear is in systems that I've been in a lot. So I've worked in San Francisco for a long time, and it's funny because that system is very small, and there's um, a lot of moving around from one center to another, and I'll have a family or a teacher come up to me and say, "Hey, I did this with the family, and I shared my concerns with them and they did not want to move forward with the referral and, their child's development kept getting a little bit, slower and, more concerns and more delays. And, then I left that position and I went to another center and that family showed up at that center and somebody else had shared concerns. And having two people share concerns meant that they were then more ready to listen, right? So what we're doing is we're just planting seeds and watering them. And someday we might watch them grow, someday we might not, right? And so what we really want to do is just walk alongside them and be ready when they are. Okay. We're coming up to the end. I know I've given you tons of information and not a lot of time to stop and process. But I do want to just talk a little bit about setting up a system. So when we're doing a universal screening system, right, we're screening all children. This sort of flow chart or workflow is what we would expect to see. And so when we're setting up a system, we want to make sure that we're prepared for all of these eventualities, right? So there's going to be kiddos where we're not concerned, right? They are, oh, I see a question. Yes, you should have a copy of the slides in that link to the handouts. There should be a PDF of all of these slides. Okay, so there's going to be kiddos where there's not a lot of concerns, right? So for these kiddos, we might, continue to, share some developmental promotion guidance, right? Next steps, next stage of development. Here are some resources. Here's some parenting tip sheets, right? About the next stage of development. And then there's going to be a small percentage of kiddos that are in that monitoring zone where we're just not really sure, right? We have to do a little bit more digging. We might say, hey, let's do some intensive interventions in just that area. And then, instead of waiting 6 months, we screen them, or 4 months, we screen them in 2 months, right? So that we're providing intervention and then we're monitoring, providing intervention and then we're monitoring. And so it might be that at that point, right, we've provided just the right amount of intervention and they're all of a sudden now meeting milestones and we can consider them back over here with these other kiddos. Or we provided all this intervention, we've been monitoring, and it's really not getting better. They still are having delays, they're still having concerns. So at that point, we might say, okay, well, this kiddo, we've done all of the work and we just don't know what's happening. We need more information, right? So then we recommend that next level of assessment, which is the diagnostic. And then there's going to be kiddos who from the bat, right? Like you're just going to say, I've done all of that. We've already tried everything. Family is really concerned. This kiddo really just needs that next step. We just need more information. So they're going to go straight to that diagnostic. And then once we get here, right, then we have some other considerations, right? They could go through that whole process with the professional doing the assessment, and they might say, hey, this child's delays don't reach the level of eligibility for our system, right? So they are not eligible, even though there are concerns, they just don't reach the level to be able to provide services, right? So those kiddos, we're going to have to go right back into the same system, right? We're going to have to keep doing the work until hopefully they either start meeting milestones or they get so delayed that they become eligible, which unfortunately happens often. But what I want to also say is that that process of diagnostic assessment, like I said, can also be really complex, right? So it starts with us doing an ASQ, and then we make that referral to early intervention, right? So that's what we were talking about, is those two systems of birth to 3, which is early intervention, and those systems in California are usually managed by a regional center. So depending on what area you're in, there is a regional center. In San Francisco, we call it Golden Gate Regional Center. I think here in the East Bay, it's East Bay Regional Center. Or if they're ages 3 to 5, they go into the early childhood special education system. And so all that goes through your local school district. They do the diagnostic assessment there. And those systems are really different. So the regional center system is really around a family service plan, right? So if they do that referral, that assessment, and they're made eligible, right, they get an evaluation. Oh, Regional Center of the East Bay. Thank you. Sorry. So when it's birth to 3, the regional center, they write an individualized family service plan. So that really looks at the whole family's ability to support this concern, right? So they really look at the family as like, how do I support this family to support this child's delay? When they reach 3 years old, and from 3 to 5, they go through the school district. That becomes an individualized education plan. And it's really focused on how do we make this child school ready? So it's really focused on goals around educational process instead of just meeting the concern. So that's why I always say earlier is better, right? Because to catch a delay at birth to 3 really is a more supportive process versus 3 to 5, where it's really just focused on the educational program. And then once they are made eligible, the family gets the services that the assessment deems necessary to answer that concern. But at any point in this process, things can go wrong, right? So that referral can be really complicated, especially if a family doesn't speak the language. During that evaluation, things can go wrong. They can be found not eligible, right? They might not even progress, but they're still concerned. So what do we do? So usually what I recommend is always following up with a primary healthcare provider, because it could be that also, especially if they're not eligible through either the regional center or the school district, it could be that a health condition is what's causing this delay. And that could make them eligible for services through their insurance, or through the healthcare sector. I also recommend giving families a lot of information and connecting them to support, right? And so Catherine and Leah talked a little bit about it, but I do know that Help Me Grow in Alameda is such a great resource. I used to work for Help Me Grow Alameda, and I know how impactful it is for families, especially families who might need extra support, who might need a little bit more support. So there is that phone line. Oh, and I wrote it wrong. It's 1-888-510-1211. Sorry. But they are bilingual, multilingual. They have care coordination services that can help families get to the most appropriate services. They also have a developmental screening program, which is really great because they can continue that screening process for families, right? They can provide the families the screening either electronically or through the post office. And they can also help that follow-up process and give information about their child's development and connect back to the care coordination or to other resources. And then their website is also just a gem of information. Just so many things that are all of the activities that are happening for families in the East Bay by neighborhood, by date. You can filter. It's such a great resource, and so I really recommend that you use that resource, especially as you're starting to build your system. And with that, I have some time for questions if you have any that I didn't answer either through the chat, because I know that these tools are really beneficial and useful, but they could be a little bit complicated, right? And so having people to talk to or asking your questions about this now can really help, and really use those resources in the handouts. Oh, and thank you, Maggie, for sharing the website link. It looks a little bit different. And thank you, everyone. Hopefully you all have a 3-day weekend to look forward to, right? I do. Monday is MLK Junior Day, and so have a really great weekend. Have a really great Friday, and thank you so much for taking the time and for being present. And I hope this was beneficial for you.
I just want to say thank you, Zulema, for bringing this presentation to
Thank
us.
you
We
so
look forward to
much.
seeing you on the 30th. And a link again will be sent out along with today's recording. And thank you all for joining us today. If you do have any questions, you're welcome to drop it in the chat and perhaps we could send it out in an email. But we hope to see you next time and have a good day.